My name is Maya Rivera. I'm 36, and right now I'm standing behind a podium in a downtown conference hall during the annual shareholder meeting. Rows of chairs hum with people, stage lights wash everything too bright, and cameras lean forward like hungry birds. My old night shift badge is folded in my pocket. I bought the suit at a thrift shop, simple, gray, no logo. The chief executive watches me like I'm an insect on the glass. The finance chief taps his pen as if time will make me forget my lines. I call for a vote to remove the leadership. I place documents on the table and I ask security to stand ready. A large investor nods and stands to second my motion. An attorney comes forward with stamped paperwork. The room tilts. Murmurs turn to gasps when I say I hold the majority. In that instant, I realize I've done something you don't often see. I'm firing people in front of their peers, and I'm about to take the chair. Before I tell you how a night cleaner took the stage and rewired a company, tell me where you're listening from. Comment below. I read them all. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more real family revenge stories that land like a small earthquake. I clock in when the city exhales. The streets go quiet, the coffee shops curl up their chairs, and I cross the lobby where the marble still remembers daytime footsteps. My cart has a vacuum, a mop, wipes, and a caddy where I keep a small spiral notepad and a pencil. The vacuum makes a steady, familiar roar that covers other sounds. The air smells like burnt coffee and warm toner. Sometimes cologne sticks to a corner and lingers like a bad memory. Motivational posters line the halls about teamwork and innovation, but at night those words feel thin and fluorescent. I empty bins that are stuffed with crumpled agendas, half-inked drafts, and calendar pages thrown away like worn-out promises. I wipe fingerprints off glass walls where meetings were held and decisions were made with no room left for my name. I listen to the building breathe, elevators sigh, doors click shut, a distant keyboard taps like someone trying to outrun sleep. I learn who lingers, finance most nights, a few engineers, sometimes legal. I memorize patterns, who works late often enough to be trusted, who sneaks in at odd hours, who argues behind closed doors. My phone sits in my pocket with a timer for study breaks. Between rooms, I practice idioms in English, sketch organizational charts from memory, and read short business articles saved offline. I time my breaks to match the building's heartbeat. When the elevator dings twice in a row, I know someone just slipped out. I map where power actually sits, not in corner offices with frosted names, but in empty chairs no one dares to occupy during daylight. The building is an ecosystem with its own food chain. Tessa Moore sits at the front desk most nights. She's a security guard who studies coding between badge checks. I bring her flashcards or a burrito when her eyes go soft from studying. The loading bay is where the maintenance crew swaps stories about busted sensors and quick fixes that never get approved. They talk about workarounds like it's a language. We rig, we hope, we sign off. Reception smiles wider for suits than for lanyards like ours, and I notice it every time. Some floors are lit on purpose at midnight. Finance and legal glow like beacons. Product floors dim earlier. The night manager says, "Stay invisible," to us like it's a blessing. I hear it as a warning. Delivery drivers drop unlabeled boxes to the upper floors. I note delivery times in my notepad. Security cameras tilt to blind spots during private late meetings. I write down the minutes the cameras look away, not the faces I don't see. Little rituals tell the real story: who gets badges renewed, who gets fewer hours, who gets calls from head office. I collect patterns. Where silence feels heavy, where laughter is brittle, where whispers bloom. Those patterns form a map more useful than any org chart. My degree sits in a drawer at home. It's a sheet of paper that didn't open doors here. I have an MBA from overseas, but degrees bounce off glass ceilings in this city. So I earn what I can and invest what I can. I buy shares in small amounts at first, especially when the price dips after bad news. I call those bargain days. I keep a simple ledger in plain language on the back of a receipt. Pay rent, buy food, keep a slice for future. I practice asking hard questions on public conference calls through a small online account, and I write down who dodges answers. I teach neighbors how to open accounts without getting scammed and how to avoid flashy promises. We pool our small amounts into a community pot and call it Baylite Partners Ledgers. Clear rules, slow growth. Our rule is simple. Patience beats pride, numbers beat noise. I study the basics at 2 in the morning on my phone: how votes work, how shareholders influence a board, how money flows through a company. I don't use big words when I write my notes. Who owns, who votes, when? I make a plan in pencil and erase as I learn more. I don't brag, I keep my buys quiet and my pocket change smaller. When a company call brags about efficiency and the stock jumps, I check the people left behind. Are their names missing in the staff list? Are lab reports shorter? I keep a rule: never overextend. If we can't buy enough to matter without starving ourselves, we wait and buy more on the next dip. I teach the group how to keep records, how to vote, how to be steady. I learned that patience and small discipline can add up to a majority if you're willing to be slow and stubborn. My ledger becomes our Bible, written in ink and humility. Rosa is my little sister by 3 years and my partner in not giving up. She runs quality tests like a detective reads a case file. She listens to devices the way other people listen to music. Our apartment stove has a dent in the front from a time we burned rice until smoke alarms sounded. Mom told us to cook, not to set the building on fire, and Dad sent a text with a list of coupons. We eat late together: rice, beans, eggs, cheap, filling, and familiar. We compare notes about the building without naming names. I tell her about the patterns I see. She tells me about test logs and the way a sensor behaves after 10 hours of heat. She calls her team honest people and hates watching warnings get softened for the sake of a slideshow. She vents, laughs, and then goes back to testing. She tucks sticky notes into her pocket like secrets and keeps a folder of charts that other people might toss. We made a promise years ago over a badly burned pan: when one of us gets a chance, both of us get a lift. Mom calls to ask if we're eating enough. Dad asks if we're saving. I say yes to both because I don't want them to worry. Rosa hides her fear behind a practical shrug. I hide mine behind lists and small buys. We both know thrift is a survival art: how to make small sums stretch, how to apologize less and do more. I tell her she's brave and she tells me I'm patient. We're both right. When I come home with a small purchase for the fund, she smiles like it's the kind of news that makes you breathe easier. When she brings a paper with a new test result, I sit at the table and we go over it, spooning rice between our fingers. We've learned to be careful with trust and generous with support. Every time the elevator doors close on our way to work, I remind myself, floors don't decide your ceiling. A custodian shrugged when I showed him. They're cutting brains to feed bonuses, he said in that low voice you use for things you're not supposed to say out loud. The line sat in my chest like a small stone that wouldn't roll away. Vendors in the loading bay started to mention delays in payments in passing as if it were gossip. A driver said, "They owe me for last month," and kept his eyes on the floor. I noticed emails left on printers that talked about non-core assets and monetized patents. The words were polite and tidy, but I wrote down the phrases anyway. People use tidy words to hide messy plans. Engineers I liked began to leave with cardboard boxes and forced smiles. They'd take a last look at their desks like they were closing a chapter on something they loved. The office felt a little emptier afterward and colder, as if someone had turned down the thermostat to match the mood. My ledger got stricter. I cut another cup of coffee out of my day and added a few more dollars to the fund. I began to think of the company as a living thing with a heart, and someone was trying to cut it out to make the numbers look better on paper. I started to record times things happened. When a lab went dark, when a manager said a test was isolated, when a shipment left earlier than it should have. I wrote dates and short notes, little steps that would map the direction we were headed. It felt wrong that decisions made in plush rooms could ripple outward to the people who actually kept things working, and it felt like a responsibility to notice. The stone in my chest hardened into something like resolve. If someone was going to sell our future for a quick headline, I didn't want to be the only one who saw it coming. Then the shoe dropped faster than I expected. Rosa's text said simply, "Emergency." I ran across the parking lot and found her sitting on a bench outside, coat wrapped tight, eyes red, a white envelope in her lap like a small accusation. She had been called into a meeting that lasted 8 minutes. They told her the role she loved was eliminated. An HR script, a box of tissues, and someone at the door with a headset to walk her out. She had tried to explain the problem she'd found, how a sensor acted wrong under heat, but the manager closed his laptop and used a voice that was all sympathy and no action. She wasn't crying for the job. She was furious because the flaw she'd warned about was going to ship. She held the envelope for a long time before giving it to me. It felt heavier than paper. We sat on the bench and watched the building's glass reflect us like ghosts. People inside moved on, elevators, late-night lights, the tired exhale of a system that thinks it can outpace its mistakes. I held her and felt the anger move through me, not like a flash but like something you could shape. She told me about the meeting in pieces. They'd said it was the company's decision, that it was time to streamline, that they appreciated her work. She had charts, test runs, dates, but the words that mattered to them were schedule and margin. Her manager had smiled with a sympathy that felt too practiced. When she left the room, she had a security guard at her side. She handed me the envelope and the silence clause inside it like a handcuff. I read the severance packet at the kitchen table, fluorescent light buzzing above. The language was thick and designed to be boring on purpose, dense paragraphs that want you to give up reading. Still, the meaning was simple. They were offering money if she promised not to speak about what she'd seen. If she signed, she'd get a check and silence. If she didn't, the checks would vanish. Her hands trembled. Mine didn't, at least not yet. I grabbed a pen and a small notebook and wrote down options we could live with. We took slow breaths and called a low-cost counselor who told us the same thing: don't sign today, ask for time. I circled dates and underlined deadlines on the paper. I marked the lines that tried to shrink her voice and wrote notes in the margins in plain words. We filed the papers in a zip folder and set 2 alarms. One for when the money would land in an account and one for the deadline that pushed silence. Rosa wanted to sleep. The packet made it hard. I promised her we wouldn't trade our safety for their secret. We agreed on ground rules: no meetings alone, everything by email or with witnesses, and a schedule for when to talk to an attorney. We also set a small, practical plan about money. How long we could manage if she walked away from the income, what expenses we could trim. It was the kind of math that keeps you honest. We talked about what the gag meant beyond words. It wasn't just about keeping a secret. It was about keeping customers, partners, and the public in the dark while decisions that could hurt people were wrapped in polite phrases. I taped a small note to our fridge: no more hushing. It felt childish, but it anchored us. That night we slept in the living room, 2 notepads on the coffee table, a quiet map of decisions between us. I told her I'd start pulling clean evidence without handing her documents over. She smiled with a tired, relieved look and said, "Good, keep the noise small." That's how we decided to start. Rosa explained the flaw in the device in a way that left no room for nonsense. She used plain words like she was talking to someone who fixed ovens. The device relies on a sensor to know what's happening in a room. The sensor has a habit of going blind just for a few seconds when it gets too hot or is used a lot. In those seconds, it doesn't see what it's supposed to see. For something that's meant to guard people, those microseconds of blind are the dangerous parts. Her tests showed the pattern over and over. Heat plus heavy use and a sensor loses sight briefly. The fix required time and budget to redesign a small component and run more cycles, but the budgets were being cut and the calendar said ship. Her team had asked for a pause in shipping until they could prove the fix worked. They were told to be team players and not to delay a launch that had investors watching. Field reports from early users were minimized as isolated incidents in internal emails. Someone reworded them so they fit a public line more easily. I sketched a simple chart on a scrap of paper while she talked, one column labeled risk to people, another risk to trust, and a third risk to brand. Each line on the paper climbed in the wrong direction. If the product failed in the field, the risk to people mattered most. If the company covered it up, the trust would fall and customers would leave. If customers left, the brand would have a scar that was harder to fix than a single refund. Rosa said the fix would cost time and some money, but she was careful to point out that ignoring the problem would cost more in the long run. The math wasn't fancy, it was common sense dressed in numbers. She showed me sample logs redacted so they wouldn't be a legal mess and explained how a simple design change would stop the sensor from going blind. The engineers had sketched options, the lab had tried prototypes. The tests showed promise when they had time to run them, but time and budget were the two things being squeezed. I folded the paper into my pocket and felt the small weight of responsibility. This wasn't just her job on the line. It was other people's safety. I thought about customers who trusted the device to do its job and who would never know a near miss had been smoothed over with a management memo. The anger that sat under my ribs moved from hot to a steady force. We couldn't let this slide. I checked public filings the way a neighbor checks a weather app, nothing dramatic, just patterns. Hidden lines in quarterly reports, a sudden spike in partner discussions in press notes, the right kind of lawyer mentioned in a throwaway paragraph. It all fit the puzzle. If they moved the patents to a friendly company, they could report cash and look smart while someone else owned the future. I thought of the lab, the solder smell, Priya's whiteboard full of half-finished ideas. Who benefits from taking the future and turning it into a clever accounting trick? Not the people who build things and not the people who use them. I remember sitting in the living room, the tape sticky on my fingers, the kitchen light buzzing, and thinking about the ripple. If they sold the core tech, research would shrink even faster. Labs would lose funding, engineers would leave, and the company would be a name on paper with nothing in the hands that mattered. The founder's stock options look better in a headline. The rest of it looks like slow fading. I could feel the injustice of it in my teeth. It wasn't just greed, it was a small, neat plan to make sure the board and the top got their checks and nobody else had a say. Rosa sat across from me, elbows on the table, watching me fit the pieces. She pushed a test log toward me and said, "If they sell, nobody will fix what's already broken." Her voice was low, steady, like she was measuring how far she could say it without shaking. I taped the last edge down and closed the folder. I didn't want to be the one who saw the whole thing and did nothing, so we made a list. Folded paper, pencil scrawl. Gather clean proof, don't trade secrets, build allies, and secure votes. The first line read, protect the people who can't afford to be brave. The next line read, learn how votes work. We added a small, vulgar note to the corner. Buy more shares when the price dips. It felt like playing a long game on a board where everyone else wanted quick wins. I sharpened the pencil and circled the annual meeting date in red. If they were going to hand our future to strangers, I wanted to make sure someone at the table still cared about the lab. Rosa needed income and she needed sleep. Customers needed to know if their devices could fail. The company needed its backbone put back in. I wrote down an urgent timeline, get proof in hand that didn't come from her files because she had a secrecy paper and we weren't going to risk her money or peace. We'd collect public filings, internal memos left in printers, dated emails sent to generic inboxes, and notes from former employees now out in the world. We'd make our case in plain language so that any shareholder could read it and understand what was at stake. I started increasing my small purchases, $10 here, a little more on bad news days. It's not glamorous, but it's a steady drumbeat. I asked neighbors to join, the ones who trusted me with packages and who had sat in church basements with me on potluck nights. Baylite partners became less of a joke and more of a plan: save, buy, hold. I set up calls with a low-cost attorney who believed in clear sentences and straight rules. We built a packet of facts that any normal person could read and say, that's bad. We weren't looking for drama, we wanted a mirror. First, I tried the soft way. I used the public tip line with a careful, factual message and got the corporate version of a "thanks, we'll look into it" reply. It read like a postcard, polite, neat, and meaning nothing. I emailed a general inbox asking for a meeting about product risk and heard nothing. I knocked on mid-level managers' doors and asked off hours if the launch could pause. I got polite shrugs or the answer, "not my call." One woman looked at me with the same tired smile the managers always practice and said, "We hear you," which is corporate for "we're filing your concern under today's noise." I learned faster than I wanted to. If you speak with the voice of a cleaner, your words float past people whose job it is to listen only to other badges. I tried to be patient. I kept notes, who shrugged, who asked for more detail, who passed me on. I stopped asking for permission to be heard and began planning how to be unavoidable. I wrote in my notebook, "When they ignore your voice, change your microphone." That felt ugly and right. I started talking to former colleagues over coffee, low-key and human. I asked for small favors. Could they confirm a date? Did they remember a phrase from a meeting? Some said no. Some met me by the park bench and handed over a printout or a recollection. I taped those notes into a binder. I learned that direct questions sent in email vanish into "we'll review" and then into silence. Paper in hand, facts with dates felt heavier than a polite email. It forced people to look down at the pages and say a name. The numbers didn't wait for me to be ready. The stock would spike on flashy speeches and sag when a whisper made sense. I bought the dips like I bought a tin of cheap coffee, practical and regular. A quarterly call came where they bragged about efficiency and the stock jumped. On paper, money looked tidy, smaller research budgets, larger bonuses for executives, and talk about focusing on core products. I scribbled my own notes in the margins of the earnings script. Research down, bonuses up. I bought a few more shares that night. Public calls became a study in avoidance. I submitted a written question and they skipped it, calling time. My name never reached the air despite being on their list. I did my math quietly. Cutting research is a short-term headline, but it slides risk down the line. Fewer tests mean more chances of things getting missed. I thought about Rosa's log and the sensor that blinked out under heat, and my chest tightened. I felt a familiar ache, the kind that comes from watching numbers float and knowing the human price behind them. I texted neighbors, "Stay steady." A few sent back thumbs up, a couple added $10, another added $100. Baylight's ledger grew in small rolls, not fireworks, and that steadiness made me stubborn. A retired janitor added his bowling winnings to the fund. Tessa sent her last month's overtime. We updated the ledger together, simple columns. Name, amount, date. We weren't trying to buy a headline, we were trying to buy a seat at the table. We were ants, as I wrote once in the notes, not elephants, but ants move mountains if they know where to push. He accepted the coffee with a small laugh and asked me where I learned to find the good mugs. I told him they were behind the break room door, the ones they hide because guests shouldn't get used to comfort. He listened when I talked, which was the sort of thing that surprised me. Most people heard you without listening. We talked about the old lab. He said it smelled like solder and ambition, and he remembered names I hadn't thought about in years. He wasn't blaming everybody, he just sounded tired of watching the same movie where the end credits paid out to a few pockets. After a long pause, he said he wanted to sell some of his stake. He spoke quietly, like the words might wake someone up. He didn't want it to go to people who would strip the company down for a headline. He told me he'd noticed me, the woman who asked questions at night, the one who noticed when the lights went out on the product floor. "You see the load-bearing walls," he said, and he meant it not as a compliment but as an observation that mattered. He asked me what I'd do if I had a say. I answered with the things I had already been whispering to myself. Protect the lab, fund the tests, give credit where credit's due. He nodded and said he'd rather take less money if it meant the company had a future that wasn't just a list of quarterly wins. He didn't offer me a check right there and then. He offered a phone call and a look that felt like a hand on my shoulder. Before he left, he said something that stuck: "Keep your powder dry." It sounded old-fashioned, like advice from a retired captain, but I understood the line, "Be ready, don't waste what you have, and when the time comes, don't miss your shot." I walked home with a lighter cart and a heavier plan. That night when I wrote the list in my notebook, his words stayed on top: patient, precise, prepared. We made Baylight partners because people trust people they see. We met in a church basement on a Tuesday after potluck, folding chairs, paper plates, the smell of beans and warm bread floating in the air. I drew the plan on a big sheet of paper: small, steady buys, clear records, no pressure. I explained voting like I'd explain a recipe: you follow the steps, you don't skip the salt, and the dish holds together. People asked questions and we answered in plain words. No one got dazzled by numbers. They wanted to know what would happen if things went wrong and what we'd do about it. Tessa came with stale coffee and a smile. She put in her last month's extra hours and said, "If this works, I want a desk in the lab." A retired janitor in a flannel shirt put down his bowling winnings and winked. A neighbor who watched my son once babysat offered $50 and a sideways grin. We picked an attorney who worked pro bono because she believed people should be able to buy a seat at a table without being eaten alive by fees. Rachel Boyd didn't talk down to anyone. She translated murky paragraphs into plain, usable steps. I became the visible face because someone had to be, but every decision needed a thumbs up from the group. We kept a ledger in a binder labeled Baylight Partners in black marker, the entries written in my hand and corrected by others. Rules were simple: no one gets pressured into selling, no one invests beyond their means, and every purchase is recorded with date and amount. We weren't dramatic, we were methodical. We had a single goal: buy enough to matter, and when we mattered, use that power to fix things, not to punish. That faith in slow, steady work felt strangely holy in a room where people were used to waiting for the next big thing. The company noticed us sooner than I thought they would. A memo came from the finance office under the bland heading of vendor cost review. It said our cleaning contract was being reduced because of new standards. Fewer hours, same expectations. They didn't say it was to make us fail, but the effect was the same. I pushed back once and got a phone call that was polite and flat: "Complain again and we'll find another crew." The threat was small but clear. My paycheck shrank and rent still wanted to be paid. We tightened everything. I cut overtime, skipped lunches out, and tracked every dollar like it mattered twice as much. I started selling things I'd kept for years, small things that felt like memories, like a postcard from a trip I never could quite afford. It hurt in the way a small loss always does, but it bought another slice of stock that day. I told myself and the people who trusted me that this was temporary, a bridge, not a prison, and I kept records to prove it. The adjustment didn't stop at money. The night manager watched me like I was testing his patience. He asked me once in the supply room, "Why stir the pot?" And I replied, "Because I'm done being the furniture." He said nothing. I cut my sleep into thinner strips to make meetings and calls to keep Baylight alive. I wrote on a sticky note and put it above my kitchen sink: "They can starve me now, or I can starve them later." It sounded angry and maybe a little dramatic, but it kept me honest. They pulled the shiny curtain out for the town hall like a Broadway set. The chief executive filled the auditorium with lights, upbeat music, and a script that smelled like a PR rehearsal. People clapped on cue as screens showed graphs with arrows that only went up. He talked about speed and fearless pivots with the confidence of someone who practiced his lines in a mirror until they sounded sincere. Marketing ran the stage, research sat in the wings like a forgotten prop. I watched the faces of the people I'd met at night, some in the audience, some missing, their desks dark. The chief executive smiled and put his hand on his heart when he said "people first," but his eyes skipped the back rows where the engineers used to sit. Questions from staff were filtered through a moderator who loved praise and hated detail. He'd pick soft questions from the front and hand the microphone like candy. I raised my hand once to ask a simple thing about the testing budget, and he moved on to answer someone else's scripted praise. After the show, assistants handed out pins and slogans. I kept mine folded in my pocket like evidence, not inspiration. I counted which leaders were on stage, marketing, sales, public relations, and noted who wasn't. The heads of research and product, that told me more than any slide. He loved the stage more than the lab, and the stage doesn't build things, it pretties them. I walked back through the lobby with my pen in my hand and a new line on a list. He loves the stage more than the lab. I started leaving little notes on late-night keyboards. You matter and don't be a stranger. It wasn't grand strategy, it was human. Exit interviews got filtered into bland phrases that sounded like apologies but smelled like lies, phrases like pursuing other opportunities that hid the fact people left because they didn't trust the product anymore. A manager joked once about trimming fat, but I saw muscle on the floor. The lab lost people who knew how to fix real problems, not polish slides. Each departure made the work of fixing the sensor more complicated. Rosa's charts suddenly needed more hands. I taped a map on my wall with arrows showing who left and which projects lost momentum. The pattern felt like withdrawal. Less testing, fewer prototypes, more polished presentations about how great everything looked. Baylight Partners bought stock quietly when those departures hit the papers and the price dipped. I watched the market like someone watching a pot that might boil over. The dips were painful to live through, worse to watch than to act on, because with each person who walked, the risk of the flaw getting ignored grew. I kept a running list in my notebook of people worth calling: engineers who'd left but still cared, product managers who'd been passed over, quality specialists who knew where the cracks were. I met a few for coffee on neutral ground. We talked in plain words about what we'd seen and what we'd worry about if no one stepped up. One night, when the building lights were low and the loading bay smelled like oil and old cardboard, a finance staffer leaned against a crate and said to me in a voice that tried to be casual, "They're paid to look past the cliff." His eyes were tired. His hands were stained with ink. He told me there was a memo moving around that tied bonuses to short-term numbers and not to safety or customer satisfaction. The words landed like a cold rain. It meant pushing harder to meet quarterly goals instead of doing the slow, boring work of fixing things. It explained the vanished budgets and the empty labs. Morale dropped and laughter in the halls turned quiet. Nervous jokes became quieter, then disappeared. Rosa's old team started sending me messages that read like goodbye notes, blunt and polite. Tessa warned me once in the security office as she handed me a sandwich. "They're watching who asks questions." She looked down at her hands like a kid trying to hide a snack. I told her to keep asking anyway, but to be careful. We stopped using email for certain things and started meeting face-to-face in public places where witnesses existed. Baylight's rule, always document, felt more important than ever. I drew 2 columns on a scrap of paper: what leaders took and what workers lost. The first column filled with years of bonuses and sleek press photos. The second filled with broken test rigs, fewer people in the lab, and quiet customers. It wasn't just money moving, it was attention and care. If the company kept valuing the shine over the shop floor, the risk to customers would become a cost no slide could explain away. That thought sat in my chest like something heavy. It made me buy a few more shares that day and call a handful of trusted former coworkers. If they were going to chase short-term applause, I wanted to make sure someone was watching the back of the room. The memo about bonuses leaked and it landed like a gust of bad weather. It was simple enough in wording: rewards for hitting numbers now, not later. It didn't say ignore safety, but it didn't need to. People read between the lines and saw what it would mean. Town halls started to feel like pep rallies, not problem-solving sessions. People who'd been worried about test budgets saw the writing on the wall and packed up their courage to leave or to quiet down. My phone filled with messages, some hopeful, some despairing. A vendor told me condescendingly that businesses change and we all adapt. I felt the word adapt like a slap. Adaptation here meant something else: cover up and move on. I sketched the effect for Rosa in plain terms. Executives get bigger bonuses, labs get smaller budgets, customers get less tested products. It's a simple trade on paper and a dangerous one in life. Her team's tests had been called costly, now we knew why. Priorities were being bent toward the next headline and away from the slow work that actually prevents harm. I wrote a note and tacked it on my fridge. If they only hear money, speak fluent money. That turned into a small internal joke in Baylight Partners, but it sharpened our approach. We would speak numbers in a language they respected, but we'd keep the human story front and center so the math didn't hide the cost. At home, the pressure came like a weather front. Mom called and told me with that steady worry in her voice that I should be careful and keep my job. It's not worth losing everything. Dad asked if I was saving enough and if what I was doing made sense for practical life. I said yes both times, and neither was the full truth. They worried about the rent, about health insurance, about the simple things that don't care if you're right. Rosa slept less. She was quieter in the mornings, like she'd used up her anger on the drive home and had nothing left to show. We argued in small, tired ways over whether to sign the papers, whether to accept the severance, whether to expose a company to risk by airing a problem. We didn't slam doors, we raised voices and then softened. I laid the plan on the table one night with the map and the calendar and the list of people who would help if asked. Rosa looked at it and said, "I trust you, but I need to breathe." Her hands found mine across the cluttered table and I squeezed them. Mom kept calling to ask if we'd eaten and Dad sent a text with a coupon clipped from the paper. Old routine crept in to remind us we were still a family trying to sleep at night. We set signals. If either of us felt unsafe, we'd pause. If either of us felt threatened by work, we'd back off. It wasn't a romantic pact. It was a survival plan. Then a letter arrived with the sort of tone meant to rattle you. It named things vaguely and suggested consequences if she spoke to unauthorized parties. It used heavy language to make normal people feel alarmed. Rosa read it out loud and the words fell between us like cold stones. I brought the letter to Rachel Boyd, our attorney, who read it and said in plain words that the company was trying to frighten her into silence. Rachel didn't use big legal terms, she said. "They're waving a fist at you, don't wave back, we'll be careful." We made new rules overnight. Rosa would not send any documents. She would speak about her memory of events in general terms and never hand over internal files that could get her in trouble. I'd rely on public filings, printouts left in printers, and testimony from people who had already left. Rachel taught us how to keep a simple record, keep envelopes, note dates, timestamp calls. We put everything in a binder with tabs labeled by date. It felt like building armor out of paper, but armor matters. Rachel wrote a short, calm response to the company asking for more time and reminding them that silencing someone doesn't fix problems. She explained, again in plain words, that threatening people only looks bad in front of others and that it might make the board ask questions. We were careful not to use the language companies love to pounce on, and Rachel insisted we keep everything above board. She set rules for what Rosa could safely say and how I could present things without exposing her to risk. The pressure tightened for a few days and then loosened a little as the company realized we weren't going to make foolish noises. I taped a small card to the fridge that read, "We don't need permission to buy a chair at the table." It was a stupid little line, but it steadied me when the night felt too long. The legal heat was real and chilling, but with Rachel's steady voice and our simple rules, we turned down the temperature on the intimidation. We didn't do anything dramatic. We kept our heads low and our records high. He sat in a vinyl booth, hands wrapped around a cup that had steam still clinging to it. The diner smelled like fried onions and bleach, the kind of place that keeps people honest. He didn't come with a briefcase or a speech. He came with tired eyes and plain words. He told me he was selling down his personal stake and that he didn't want it falling into hands who'd strip the company for a headline. He said he remembered the woman who cleaned late and asked stubborn questions, the one who noticed which floors stayed lit. He'd been watching in a way that made my stomach twist, like a friend who'd seen the house change and didn't like the look of it. He explained he wanted the buyer to be someone who cared about the lab, not just the stock price. He didn't want to see patents moved to a different name and forgotten. He offered his block of shares with the condition that the buyer would keep the company's core intact. I told him we were small, that we were just a group of neighbors and a few night shift workers who pooled what we could. He smiled and said he'd rather take less money if it meant the future would be protected. He wasn't speaking in numbers, and that felt right. He was talking about values. Before he left, he handed me a small card with his phone number and said, "Call my lawyer, tell her you're serious." He didn't offer a price then, he offered trust and a chance. I felt the weight of it the whole walk home, like a small stone in my pocket. That stone turned into a plan. If Douglas wanted the company saved from short-term choices, we could be the kind of buyer who would fight for the lab. The idea felt huge and ridiculous and possible all at once. I slept badly that night, but with purpose. Rachel set up a meeting at a small community bank that still had a teller who knew most customers' names. The banker met us in a neat office with potted plants and a clock that ticked loud. I brought our ledger, letters from Baylite members, and the scraps of proof we'd gathered. I spoke plainly. We wanted a modest loan to help buy a block of shares and hold them for the long term. The banker asked simple questions: how much, who's in the group, how would we pay it back? I answered in plain words about rent, small savings, and steady buys. He listened like someone who handled checkbooks for a living and liked plans that didn't rely on wishful thinking. Rachel sat beside me and translated the banker's notes into things we could meet. The terms weren't glamorous, they were fair and manageable. The loan would be something we could handle without risking anyone's home. Signing the papers felt like promising to myself and the people who trusted me that this was not a vanity move. It was a bridge to a seat at the table. We left the bank with a stack of approved forms and a quiet sense of relief. The group chat that night filled with small celebration, texted photos of takeout meals and thumbs-up emojis. We didn't toast with champagne, we toasted with paid bills and the knowledge that we could breathe a little easier. We widened the circle slowly and carefully. I knocked on neighbors' doors, knocked on the doors of people whose hands I knew from church potlucks and nighttime deliveries. Tessa gave what she could from a recent overtime check and said, "If this works, I want a badge that opens the lab door." A retired janitor put down his bowling winnings with a wink and said he believed in fairness. Mom sent a small sum she'd clipped from a coupon stash, and Dad asked if he could help by watching the house if we needed a meeting spot. Each person signed clear forms that Rachel had prepared, with lines explaining risks in plain language. You could lose what you put in, and options for withdrawing under agreed conditions. Nobody got pressured. Nobody invested beyond what they could bear. We met in church basements and small kitchens, and once in my apartment with mismatched chairs. We explained the plan step by step in simple language. We buy, we hold, we vote as a group. We set rules. No one sells without group approval. Every purchase is recorded and decisions are collective. Rachel checked every form and made sure people understood the risks and rewards. We hosted a potluck where people brought food and questions. The day was noisy and warm, with kids coloring at one table and neighbors asking blunt, useful questions at another. It felt like building something small and honest out of the scraps of ordinary lives. People didn't join because they loved drama, they joined because they were tired of being invisible. The paper trail became our backbone. I gathered filings that were public, press releases with carefully worded promises, and the shredded slides I'd taped at my table. I kept a log of dates when labs went dark and when managers spoke about focusing on core in earnings notes. Rosa helped translate technical language into plain risk. She'd describe how a sensor went blind in heat without using any of the company's internal files. Former employees who'd left for better jobs met me for coffee and offered recollections and printed emails that backed up the story. I copied every public chart and clipped every headline that hinted at a sale. Rachel taught me how to organize the packet so that any shareholder could read it and understand. Timeline, consequences, simple proofs. We avoided shiny accusations and stuck to fact. What happened when research budgets fell? Who left when messages about non-core assets started appearing? We prepared one-page slides that said the truth in plain lines. Rachel stamped copies, notarized a few letters, and rehearsed with me until my voice didn't shake. We weren't trying to make noise for drama, we were building a clean, unavoidable set of facts that made sense to anyone who cared to look. The binder grew, and so did my confidence. Every page we added felt like a footstep toward the meeting where we'd have to speak louder than the polished presentations. I sold a few things I loved to keep buying shares, small things, not the house or anything that mattered, but a bracelet my grandmother had given me. It felt like taking off a chain and feeding the future. I wrapped it in tissue and mailed it straight to the bank. The act felt both obscene and right. I texted Rosa a picture of the empty wrist and she sent back a thumbs up and a heart. That small exchange steadied me that day more than anything. I sent a formal notice to the company secretary asking for recognition as a shareholder and requesting a slot at the annual meeting. I booked a cheap, plain suit from a thrift store and practiced my speech into the bathroom mirror until the words sounded like steady steps and not tremors. I learned how to breathe on the lines where they might try to shame me. I practiced being calm and precise because drama is easy and facts are not. I told Rosa, after this, we can't go back, and she hugged me so tight I could hear her breath in my ear. Good, she said, I'm with you. We both knew the truth. Once you push through a door and change who gets to speak, you don't unring that bell. I stopped making escape plans and started making a map of the room I planned to change. I pinned a cheap suit on a chair by the door and put the folder with the taped slides and our notes inside it. The back of the envelope read, "No turning back." The door behind us clicked. The path forward was the only one we'd practice. I walked into the rented auditorium in a suit that didn't have labels but had a clean line. The carpet smelled like too strong coffee and the chairs were a little too soft for the seriousness of the room. I sat near the aisle with a slim folder on my lap and a small breath to steady my voice. Executives took the stage with the practiced shine of people used to applause. Their smiles were made for camera lights and polished by rehearsed lines. Shareholders shuffled papers and checked phones. A few faces in the room recognized me from the night's nicknames and shoulder nods when our paths crossed in the lobby. Some smirked, the sort of look that says, "There she is, the cleaner," and it felt like a small provocation which I saved for later. When the Q&A began, I stood up during the open portion and said my name, my country, and why I was there. I kept my tone calm. The mic felt like an instrument, not a weapon. I said I was a shareholder, that I held a stake small in size but grown over time, and that I had a few questions about what the company had been doing to its research budget and why it seemed to favor short-term sparkle over long-term safety. The chair tried once to skip me the way one tries to skip a bad line in a script, but I held the mic and didn't let it go. The room grew tighter, lights felt hotter and cameras leaned in like hungry birds. My hands didn't shake. I had practiced that. The folder on my lap was light, but it had weight where it mattered. Facts. I started with a simple slide, a one-page image I handed to the moderator to show. It had 3 plain lines. Research funding down, executive payouts up, customer complaints up. I read the numbers aloud in a voice that tried to be boring because boring facts are hard to knock down. I matched dates from press releases to when labs went dark and to when budgets were cut. I read brief quotes from their own public statements and held them next to outcomes, promises made, promises missed. I asked directly why they'd let the flagship product ship if tests showed a recurring issue in heat. The chief executive smiled as if he'd practiced that smile, and he said, "You don't understand our strategy." I said, "I understand the people who use our product." That line landed like a small stone in a quiet pool. There was a pocket of applause from the back, people who worked nights and had seen the labs empty. It couldn't be staged, it was simple and honest. The chair tried to move the meeting on. He stammered over procedures as if a new clause had entered the room. I kept my questions short and direct and let the slides show the rest. The finance chief checked his phone, his face lost color under the stage lights, and the murmurs began to rise. I stayed steady, letting the evidence speak in plain sentences that anyone in the room could understand. My voice sharpened, not loud but accurate. The slide did the shouting. Then the side doors opened and Rachel Boyd walked in with a folder that had a courthouse stamp you can't fake in front of a crowd. She carried the papers like a quiet bomb, neat, exact, and final. She announced that Baylight Partners had completed its combined purchase of shares, including a significant block sold by Douglas King, correctly filed and current. The room shifted on its feet like a table finding a new center of gravity. Board members leaned across one another, whispering fast, pulling at papers like people searching for a missing line in a contract. Counselors flipped pages and the air tasted metallic with surprise. Daniel Price, an investor whose voice carries in meetings, stood up as if the room had handed him a baton. He said plainly he would second the motion and that he supported a vote to remove leadership who'd hollowed out research and put short-term gains over product safety. I called for the vote to replace the board members aligned with those decisions and to remove the chief executive and the finance chief from their posts. Ballots were distributed and collected. The hush was a held breath that could break into a cheer or a sob. Results came back and the motion passed. The applause that followed was not loud like a show, but long and full, the sort of sound that means something deeper has shifted. Security moved with the calm of people who'd been told to be ready. The room exhaled and my shoulders felt 15 years lighter. Once the room calmed, I announced the appointments I'd planned with help from Baylight and Rachel. Priya Nanda would be interim chief executive. She walked to the stage without fanfare, no slides, no rehearsed slogans, just a straight list of what would happen first. I picked her because she built things and faced problems, not because she liked lights. I asked her to restore testing budgets and to refocus teams on product safety over short-term numbers. Rachel read a list of immediate actions we had agreed on: freeze non-essential perks that had been draining money, start a proper audit of recent decisions, and pause any deals that would move our core patents out of our hands until the new board could review them. We added 2 seats to the board for operators who had shipped real products and had a track record of delivering results, not just headlines. I said out loud what we had written in our packet: no revenge firings. People who had made mistakes would be held accountable, yes, but not fired out of spite. We needed knowledge and continuity as much as we needed change. I also announced a practical step that mattered to me personally. Rosa would be brought back on as a paid consultant to help fix the flaw she had warned about. I stated it plainly so there could be no confusion. Her work would be credited in writing and her role would have clear support and resources. The room absorbed each step as if it were a new set of rules for a game none of us had expected to play. Priya finished by saying she'd start with direct, face-to-face meetings with teams in the lab and with customers who had voiced concerns. She did not promise miracles. She promised time, focus, and a plan you could understand. When we walked off the stage, I felt both light and heavy. Light because the immediate threat had been removed, heavy because the work to fix what was broken was only starting. I put everything on the record because quiet changes can be reversed. I announced the Open Door Lab, a simple program that paid small bonuses for ideas from any employee, from engineers to maintenance staff, and yes, including people who cleaned at night. The idea was small but practical. You don't have to be a director to see a problem, and sometimes a janitor spots a pattern a lab tech misses. We published a customer callback plan too. A clear promise to reach out to users affected by the issue to explain what went wrong, what we were fixing, and when they could expect a remedy. Transparency, I said, is the currency that buys trust back. We set a timeline for the patch. Test cycles, independent review, and clear checkpoints that customers and regulators could see. I put Rosa's name in the announcement. She was being rehired as part of the team and would get credit in writing. That mattered to her and to the people who had been told to keep quiet. We also redirected some executive perks into research funds. It was a visible move: fewer private jets, more solder and lab time. Cameras were rolling and the statements were recorded, which meant our commitments couldn't be unmade in a press release. I closed by telling the room, simply and plainly, that we would be known for what we built, not what we hid. The cameras angled closer and the words landed in ways that felt permanent. When I stepped down, I felt the unusual sensation of surrendering the microphone and trusting that the people I'd chosen could hold it. 15 years of pushing a vacuum felt like it had led to this simple, noisy, truthful thing. The victory didn't stop the small sabotage. Doors that used to open with a tap now asked for permission. A few middle managers refused to hand over files, claiming lost passwords or archival issues. It looked like clerical problems, but the pattern was clear. Systems the finance chief touched became mysteriously harder to access. Rooms we needed were booked under vague meeting titles that meant nothing to those who actually did the work. It felt petty and it felt dangerous because when people keep information close, you stall a company's repair. An ally slid me an old printout with a list of systems the previous finance chief had controlled. It read like a shopping list of places a person could hide papers or delay audits. We set up a command center in a plain conference room with a whiteboard and sticky notes. The whiteboard had a grid, what we needed, who owned it, and who could unlock it. Priya redirected tech leads to rebuild access lists. She brought in pizza and patience and no yelling, just checklists and 2-hour sprints. I went floor to floor, shaking hands, explaining the plan and asking people to show up. Face-to-face conversations cut through a lot of petty resistance. People are less likely to hide a file if the person asking is standing beside them and looks like they plan to stay. Outside the building, the noise started. Anonymous posts called us amateurs and warned of mass exits. Someone started a thread that said our new leadership would cause layoffs and chaos. A client called, edge in their voice, asking if we were pulling back from support. I took a breath and corrected the record, booked a demo, and promised them a schedule where they could watch fixes happen. Rumors about lawsuits and a return by force from the ousted leaders floated around, but we kept ignoring the gossip and focused on the work at hand. A supplier asked for earlier payments, worried about chaos, and a few asked for higher rates to keep supplying parts. We negotiated fair terms, documented every promise, and kept the supply chain moving. Daniel Price connected us with a steady public relations person who believed in simple statements rather than spin, and together we published a brief, honest note to customers. Here's what went wrong, here's what we're doing, and here's who to call if you need help. It wasn't perfect PR, but it was honest. People appreciated being spoken to like adults. Then the smaller consequences started to bloom outward and intertwine. My ex-husband, Jason Carter, surfaced with a crooked smile and a vague claim that he deserved a share of whatever came next. He'd always been good at appearing where there was light. Rachel reminded me that our divorce had settled years ago and that nothing in our joint past meant he had a claim to new assets. He posted a messy story online and tried to make himself relevant, but when I said nothing and kept working, his post fizzled. A regulator asked for a meeting to discuss customer complaints. We welcomed them, brought clear data, and offered the fix plan without frills. That meeting felt like being under a microscope, but Rachel and Priya had prepared everything in plain language. We showed what had happened, what we were fixing, and a timeline. The regulator liked the clarity and the willingness to follow through more than 1,000 corporate apologies. That meeting turned a possible crisis into a supervised check-in. Employees asked if more layoffs were coming. I answered honestly, not for speaking up, not for telling the truth. That line mattered to people who weighed silence against rent and health insurance. A major client threatened to pause orders until they could see the patchwork under the worst conditions. Priya suggested we set up a live test with their team on site, yes, in conditions that would stress the product. We wrote a checklist with clear pass and fail criteria that anyone could follow. It felt risky, but it was the only way to show we meant what we said. Then came the live test day, and it looked like a controlled storm. The room was intentionally hot, fans were set to simulate stress, heaters hummed, and devices lined up like soldiers. If the patch failed in those conditions, the client would walk and our new board would look foolish. Rosa stood with a clipboard and a paid badge for the first time since the severance packet. She had the look of someone who'd survived and come back with a purpose. The first 3 runs passed, the 4th hiccuped, and we held our breath. It was a setup issue, a cable misaligned. We fixed it, admitted the mistake publicly, and ran the tests again. 2 more runs passed under heavy load and the green lights stayed green. After the test, I shook the client's hand and said, "We'll earn your trust every week, not just today." It felt honest and small, and it bought us the chance to prove it over time. That night, I fell asleep on a couch in my small office, shoes on, an alarm set for dawn. I was exhausted and oddly calm. The ship had righted a little, but the work of steadying it would be long and grinding. There was no triumphant ending, only the slow grind of repairing things people used and trusted. I had wanted revenge for years in the form of an ouster and a public callout, but what mattered more now was rebuilding with the people who'd been overlooked. That turned out to be a habit I wanted to keep. Rosa stood beside Priya with a clipboard and an ID badge that said consultant. Watching her there, paid and credited, felt like a writing of something that had been bent for too long. Her hands moved with the calm of someone who'd already seen the problem and decided to fix it. Priya had a checklist taped to the wall and a voice that cut through the noise. Simple, clear directions and an insistence that we call out mistakes loud and fast. That honesty was a new atmosphere in a room that used to prefer quiet fixes. The client's team watched with a kind of guarded hope. They weren't there for promises, they were there for runs that would show the product under the worst conditions the device might see in real life. The first 3 runs were green, steady, quiet successes that made shoulders relax a little. The 4th run hiccuped and my heart jumped. For a half-second everyone went mute, each of us holding on to the thread of what would happen if the light turned red. We checked the logs right there, loud enough for the client to see we weren't hiding anything. It was a setup issue, a cable that had popped loose in the course of the test. Not a design failure, not the thing we feared. We fixed it on the spot, explained it to the client, and ran the tests again. 2 more runs passed under full heat and heavy use, green lights all the way. The client chief stood, clapped once, and then looked at Rosa like he'd met a person who'd saved him money and worry. He signed a renewal with a clause for quarterly walkthroughs and an outside auditor spot check. That clause mattered more than the handshake. It meant we'd be watched, and being watched would keep us honest. That day taught me something I'd been arguing with myself about for years. Fixing things in public is scarier than fixing them in secret, but it's the only way to rebuild trust. When we admitted a small mistake in front of everyone, then fixed it, we earned a credibility that no memo could buy. I slept on a couch that night with my shoes on and an alarm set for dawn, not because I was afraid we'd fail again, but because the work of keeping promises is heavy and steady, and it doesn't end with a single test. We rolled the patch out in stages with clear notes and real timelines, no spin, no confetti. Each update included what changed and why, with a phone number for anyone who needed help. Complaints dropped week by week. The support line stopped sounding like a fire alarm and started to sound like a normal busy office. People wrote back with thanks and sometimes named technicians who'd actually helped them, and we started sending small bonuses and shoutouts to those names. Those messages mattered more than any press release. The client who watched the live test renewed and asked for quarterly check-ins. That was a real vote of confidence. The first quarterly update under the new leadership showed a smaller pile for executive rewards and a larger slice for research and testing. It wasn't a full recovery, but it was a course correction that the numbers showed in a way anyone could read. The charts looked less flashy but steadier, and that steadiness helped conversations where dollars met trust. The Open Door Lab paid out its first small bonuses to night staff whose ideas actually saved power in testing rigs. I stood in the lab when a night janitor's name went on the wall next to a small photo. He smiled like a man who'd been seen, and I felt something in my chest loosen. Tessa moved into a paid apprenticeship on the security team while she finished her coding course. Her badge opened the lab door now, literally and symbolically. Priya started showing boring slides in meetings, schedules, checklists, test results, and people started to lean in more than clap. Boring that works became our new motto. I took Mom and Dad to the building when the dust settled a little. Mom cried in the lobby, hands folded tight like she'd been holding them for years. Dad, who's always been practical, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Proud of you, kid," in that clipped, simple way he uses when feelings get too big. We walked the lab and smelled solder again. It smelled like the beginning, not the end. Rosa signed a full-time offer and bought Mom a new stove with her first paycheck. Dad got better work boots. I walked past the auditorium where everything changed and whispered to the empty seats, "Never again." The lab had people who'd been overlooked placed where they could matter. People who'd been quiet were asked for suggestions and paid when those suggestions saved time or money or safety. If this story landed with you, tell me what city you're listening from and share your story in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you need a nudge, remember this: quiet plans can change loud rooms.